I might do global research, right? I might be doing global work, but I also know that giving back to my college community, for example, is really important because I'm only here for 4 years, and it would be ignorant of me to go out and try and help people abroad without really paying too much attention to people here on campus. So it's like, recognizing that inspiration and impact is beyond, achievements or reward. It's building those relationships and sustaining those relationships.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Oh My Curry Goodness. My name is Hamza Islam, and on each episode of this podcast, I talk to Gen Zers from different fields about their story and the experiences that have shaped them into who they are today. My goals for this podcast is to take a few lessons away from each guest, whether that's their mindset, skills, or tools they have learned in their life that they think can help myself or you guys as listeners. And secondly, I also want to be able to talk to my guests as human beings because while they have done incredible things in their life, regardless of what they're doing, there's a lot of challenges they have either gone through or still going through. And I really want to be able to talk to them as human beings because we are all, hopefully, human beings and we all have something that we really want to go after. And all of us will have challenges, but I really do want to create a sense of that feeling of you're not alone. I know that's a common thing in mental health, but I really do want to create a podcast where you really don't feel alone. And even though challenges vary from person to person, that you're still able to overcome those obstacles at the end of the day. Now, speaking of mental health, my guest this week is Seika Brown, who is a mental health activist and founder of YLG, or Youth Led Global Research, which aims to discover how mental health is defined across cultures and backgrounds. Now, if this name sounds familiar, it could be one of two things or two reasons. Either one, last month, Seika was recognized by Selena Gomez for her work in mental health, or if you have been a follower of this podcast, you may remember that Seika was a guest back in February. So you can pick your bowl of curry, which however you want to remember her by, but nevertheless, Seika Brown, thank you so much for coming back to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. And just want to give a quick FYI, if you see any cats running around in the background, just ignore them.
Oh my gosh, that's totally fine. If anything, if you were to ask me if I prefer cats or dogs, I would prefer cats. So that's cool. But nevertheless, it's so great to be able to connect with you. It's weird because I you were a guest. I know we talked about this in the past about you potentially becoming a returning guest, but I didn't think it would be this quick just because there were so many schedule conflicts. So I'm really happy to be able to have you on. And one of the things I want to start talking about is how I said that you were recognized by Selena Gomez for your work in mental health. And I know that comes from the fact that you're part of her Rare Beauty program. And when I heard that you were being recognized for your work, firstly, I was really happy for you. But the one thing I do want to talk about is what that does for your self-confidence, because I know when we talked, and I was listening back to our last conversation, and some of the things you had talked about were the negative feedback you get from people, no matter where they come from. And I want to ask because when I think of being recognized by someone as influential as Selena Gomez, there's two things that come to mind, which is there's that good feeling of you can say whatever you want, but here's someone who recognizes me for the work that I do. And so it's almost like a shield of some sense. On the other side, or on the other hand, it's also like, well, because of how many people know her, now that increases the number of trolls, quote unquote, that might come after you. I know it's a weird way of putting it, but I am curious to know, like, when you're being recognized by Selena Gomez, what does that do for your self-confidence?
Yeah, I mean, I think I try pretty hard to make sure that my confidence isn't resting in my achievements or things that I've been awarded. Equally, like I think that goes both ways, so it doesn't get to my head. But then also like knowing that people who are these trolls, like you're saying, or maybe disagree with the work that I'm doing, they don't know the whole picture. And I think the people that do know the whole picture are like my friends and my family, and just knowing that I have them in my lives and I'm able to build those relationships, remind me of what's important to me and how I define success, right? So that's kind of like what it looks like.
For sure. And it's funny because when I saw that, I saw your post reacting to what that moment was like for you. And of course, you were happy for the fact that you're able to be recognized. But what was more important was how you want to encourage people to have conversations when it comes to mental health. And obviously, with the work that you do, it's the topic around mental health is different. But what I love about you and why I thought that was really interesting was I think a lot of people when I think it goes back to I'm trying to figure out the right way to say this, but it's like you want the conversation to be bigger than yourself, right? So like if I went back 5 or 6 years back in the past and I met a 16-year old Seika, I don't think her goal when it came to mental health was I want to be recognized by the best, quote unquote. It's more of I
Mhm.
want to be part of this conversation because it has affected my friends, it has affected myself. And so it's almost like I use this analogy and it's a cringy analogy, but I think it's still true, which is that it's almost like, you know, Selena Gomez being recognized by Selena Gomez is like the icing on the cake,
Yeah.
but everything else is, but like what makes a cake good is not the icing. It's a cool thing to have, but like people care more about the content or the message, or in this case, the cake in itself. So I think that's what I really love about like one, obviously congratulations, but secondly, it was yes, I'm being recognized, but that still doesn't change why I do the things that I do. I don't know if that made sense, but I think learning, seeing what you did made me realize like we need to have a it doesn't always have to be about us. It has to be something bigger that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've tried to make a conscious effort in my work um, to not make it solely about myself and my experience, right? And I do think in the field like mental health, that's extremely valuable and it's important to share your story. But I think also as a cultural researcher, my whole goal is to share other people's stories. And encourage connection outside of research, but really enforce it, between just people, right? Like I wanted people to have conversations between their families and their friends. I think that's a lot more rewarding than getting recognized by Selena Gomez. I think that was a really cool opportunity, and I think I was really blessed for it. But like you said, like the main goal has never been being recognized for mental health work. It's for promoting and advocating for mental health for everyone, right? So the real success is if more people are having conversations.
Our generation wants to focus around being an inspiration. We want to be able to be known as a generation that wants to make an impact. And I know that is technically what every generation believes, but like for us, when we are starting something, we care more about giving back and going against the current instead of following the current. Now, obviously, you may not be the best person to ask this, but I think in a way you also are, which is that I think there are a lot of people that sometimes don't know, they kind of struggle, I guess, like imposter syndrome in the sense that you have a really good message, you have good intentions, but then some people will be like, well, we think this person is good because of their statistics. So obviously I'm sure you still have challenges even today, but people will go, oh, I want to work with Seika because she's worked with these people. Now, we kind of talked about this the last time you were here, but I'd love to bring that conversation back in case it's changed your perspective in any sense. But what advice would you give to people that are sometimes struggling with like, hey, Seika, I really believe in the work that I do, but I feel like I have to chase this material sort of like accolades thing because that's what people seem to go after. But you know this better than yourself that it's about what you're trying to do instead of trying to chase something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think my perspective on it has only grown with time. Um, yeah, I think what I would say is like my main piece of advice is that if you want to be an inspiration and if you want to make an impact, like look at the people around you, right? Like you can post on social media, you can go out and like do all these great things, but like how are you impacting those closest to you? Right? How are your close friends seeing you? How are the relationships that you care about or being nurtured. And I think that's where inspiration lays. And I think that's where true impact lays. If we all cared a little bit more about being there for the people we love, then that will create a radical impact, right? It's kind of like throwing a stone in the water and you see the ripples. It's exactly that, right? So I think for me, it's hard. You want to be recognized. I think everyone wants to be given like a pat on the back for the work that they do. But at the same time, I think I have great hope that people aren't thinking of just themselves, right? You're not thinking of doing mental health work or talking to people on a podcast just for yourself. You're talking because there's something there that's important for everyone to see. So yeah, I think look at the relationships around you, look at the places around you, look at the community around you. I might do global research, right? I might be doing global work, but I also know that giving back to my college community, for example, is really important because I'm only here for 4 years, and it would be ignorant of me to go out and try and help people abroad without really paying too much attention to the people here on campus. So it's like, recognizing that inspiration and impact is beyond, achievements or reward. It's building those relationships and sustaining those relationships.
One thing I wanted to add, and I forgot at the moment, but now I remember it, which is that um, again, it goes back to the idea of making something bigger than yourself. If your goal, if I again went back in time when you were 15 or 16 or whatever, and you said, I want to be recognized for the work that I do, I want to work with so and so or whoever, then it almost feels like everything between the first day you started to now feels like everything else feels like bait. Like, hey, I want to do this so you can help me get this. And that's not really being an inspiration. And even if people never find out, you will still, I mean, I believe in karma. Like whatever you do, good or bad, will happen to you. So will happen back to you. So I do think that I know there are people that still focus on like what's your statistics look like, but at the end of the day, that one person doesn't represent everyone else's opinion. Everyone else can see it differently, and there are people that will not like what you do, but there are also people that see the work that you do, even if it doesn't make sense. They're like, I know what they're trying to do. Um, but one last question I want to ask before we move on to another thing, which was this question has been bothering me for like 2 months since I reached out to you about this podcast. But so I hope I don't get trolled for this, but one of my favorite songs by Selena Gomez was, or yeah, was Come and Get It,
Mhm.
because she blends in a lot of like South Asian music. And I think in the music video, there's a popular drum in India. I forget what it is, but it's a pretty good song. I'm not gonna lie, but did you ask her the burning question if she liked curry? I am genuinely curious to know.
Unfortunately, I didn't. I probably should have texted you when I went to go meet her. I should have thought about that. But I'm sure she does. Like, what kind of person doesn't like curry? And I think, again, it was a great opportunity to be at that event. And so next time, I will be sure to ask her that question.
Yes, that'll be the million-dollar question. I want to I want to take this conversation to a different route because mental health matters a lot to you, but also gratefulness, and not just the good, but the bad. And I know you've talked about in many interviews how your mental health journey of some sort goes back to when you were 15 and you had the psychology project, and then your principal said, oh, this idea is stupid. And obviously you started taking this mental health journey. But I also feel like there are other things that can happen in your life where you might go, this is the worst thing to have ever happened to you, but you're able to look back and go, I'm really glad that I went through this experience because it helped me become a better person. So if we were to, obviously that conversation with your principal is one aspect, but are there other moments in your life where if you went back in a time machine and you said, this was the worst day of my life, or this was one of the hardest days of my life, but I'm glad I went through this experience because it's helped me become a better human being? Like, what are some of the, do you have other moments, or do you feel like that itself was like the, I hate this, but I'm grateful that I experienced this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've talked about this before. with you and other people, but I was always interested in mental health because when I was 8 years old, my older brother attempted suicide. And he was 12 years old at the time, and I'm very close to my brother. And that's usually the story that I tell when it's like, why mental health? And then like that's the story. And then when they ask how mental health, the answer is, my psychology project when I was 15. So, however, I don't think anyone really ponders the effects of having someone so close to in your life consider suicide to not even just consider suicide, right? It was more than just suicide, suicidal ideation. It was actual action. And I think within my family, I've seen, a lot of people struggle with like drug abuse, alcohol abuse, whether it be, now or when I was super young. I think my family grew up on the low income side, definitely struggled a lot more. My mom immigrated here from Japan. She actually had me when she was 40 years old, so she's a little bit older. And also, I don't think a lot of people talk about the difficulties of having a mom or a dad or a parent that is a little bit older. She's like 63-ish now, so she's kind of the age of some of my friends' grandparents, which is crazy. Not to call my mother old, so I hope she's not listening to this, but I think there's a lot of those moments that I could pinpoint. If my brother attempted suicide when he was 12, like the big question I think of is like, okay, what prompted him to attempt suicide? What was going on? And I think there's a lot of correlations to, right, my parents' struggles or being low income, etc. But I think, and even now, like I think we talked about this before, I lost a friend to suicide throughout my college experience. I've seen a lot of my friends struggle with a multitude of issues. And then doing mental health work is not easy. I think you hear a lot of difficult stories. And there's so many moments, I think, that were traumatic one way or another. But to me, I think, ironically enough, the hardest thing I would say I've ever been through comes down to like 4 distinct moments in my life. And they all kind of go around this theme of saying goodbye or the sense of nostalgia. I think the first time was when my older brother, again, he's my best friend. I love him. When he moved out for the first time, I think he was about 19 or 20 years old, my junior year of high school. And he moved out to go move in with his girlfriend and his friend because they were all starting college. And my brother's girlfriend is his now wife, which is very exciting. And I think that was difficult because like I said, my brother and I grew up really close, and seeing him be able to be alive and move into this house with his friend and his girlfriend and like start his own life was really sentimental to me. And I think that was really hard because I was thinking about all these difficult moments that led up to his success. Equally, when I graduated high school and I flew to New York for the first time to start college, I think that was really nostalgic and sentimental. I was thinking about my own experience and all the friendships that I was able to build. And just how saying goodbye to them was really a pinpoint, one of those core memories, I think people would call them. And then my sophomore year of college, through a bunch of events, I ended up living with three of some of my really good friends, one of which actually was a PhD law student from the Netherlands that was visiting that semester. And it kind of just felt like a movie is the best way to put it, even if it's cheesy and cringy to say. And like, I think saying bye to them at the end of that semester was hard, right? So my friend flew back to the Netherlands and my other 2 friends graduated to college. And I was kind of like stuck, like, okay, I have to do the next 2 years without them here. And then I think the 4th moment where I would say this is one of the hardest moments of my life is this past summer, saying bye to my friends from home. They're like my family. I consider them my sisters and my brothers. I consider their parents like my parents. I call them, I text them. And my mom actually ended up moving back to Japan just a few months ago. And so at the end of this summer was kind of this last moment where I would call Seattle like a home base. And I know I always have a home in Seattle, but I don't think I'm ever going to forget one of my friend's moms the night before I left, hugging me and telling me, she's like, this is your home. And you will always be coming home whenever you come here. And I think the reason why I say those are my hardest moments is because when you go through something difficult in life, you want to get through it, right? Like you don't want that hard thing anymore. But I think when you have something good and you see the good thing come to an end in one form or another, you're like, actually, I don't want that to change. And I think that's why I say it's one of the hardest moments in my life. And I'm very grateful for it because it's this multitude of emotions that I'm able to experience. The gratefulness I have for coming through so many difficulties in my life, experiencing so many things in my life, but at the same time, being able to celebrate, the joy of having these relationships that are so hard to see them shift with time. Um, I'm still close with all these people. I talk to them like on a daily basis. I call them, I text them daily. I'm seeing my brother over winter break and all these. And one of my best friends actually, she's coming to visit just next week in Ithaca. And I think that's how I view hardship and difficulty is that it's not all these, heartbreaking moments. Like obviously when my brother attempted suicide or all these, when my parents struggled with, things like suicidal ideation or anything, of course that's difficult. But I think the reality is being able to look back on my life and see it turn out better than I expected, that is so much emotion. So yeah, like I have so much gratitude because there's just a mixing pot of nostalgia, of joy, of grief, of mourning, and remembrance. So I'm not too sure if that makes sense, but that's how I would describe my hardest moments.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And thank you so much for being able to share that. I remember like thinking about, because obviously that's something I know you are very passionate about, which is gratefulness. And it's like sometimes it can be a difficult line to maneuver just because, you are reflecting back through those moments. And I do want to ask you, I think a lot of people fall into this issue where when they have a difficult situation that they're going through, I think the most common, well, not I think everyone would say the most common question they ask themselves is, when am I going to get out of this difficult situation? And when I look back, and I've had to ask that, I've asked that question a couple of times in the past, and I feel like that may not be the best question to ask because it's such a very broad question. And I remember
Mhm.
when I interviewed, it's sort of similar to how I interviewed Francesca Reuketer, and she talked about how she doesn't want to go from a bad something about like a negative mindset to a positive mindset because that's difficult. It's like a negative mindset and then take those little baby steps to get to a positive mindset. I might have to check to make sure I made sense. But what I do want to ask is, when you're going through, and obviously that's a very broad thing because obviously you've talked about how there's different events in your life, but when you are going through a difficult challenge, what questions are you asking yourself to help navigate through this difficult thing? Or do you feel like the only questions you are asking yourself at the end of the day is, when am I going to get out of this difficult situation?
Yeah, first off, I love Fran. She's a good friend of mine. I think everyone in the mental health field probably knows each other one way or another. So it's super cool that you talked to her. I think I saw that episode go up and I was like, let's go. But yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to have this like perspective, like, how am I going to get out of this? Like, when is this going to end? And I don't blame anyone who has that, like those thoughts, because like I said, like the majority of people, if you're going through a stressful time, you will want it to end. I feel like that's a very natural human thing that it's not even just human. I think that's just biology of species. Um, I think because I think I've had so much practice and an understanding of mental health. Usually my thought processes are like, how can I calm down a little bit? Like, how can I breathe and like look at the situation around me and say, like, okay, I'm not going to let it have power over me. Like, because the situation is just a situation. Um, and I think there's multiple circumstances we go through at once, right? Just because I'm having a stressful day because of my classes doesn't mean my friendships are falling apart. And just because I'm having a hard conversation with a friend doesn't mean like I don't have a roof over my head. And like those things can't equate to each other. So I think allowing yourself having the space to be stressed, to have difficult conversations, to go through something difficult with the recognition that it's not the end of the world is really important. So I think the question I mainly ask myself is like, is this as big as it feels? If it is, like, how can I manage it? And if it's not, how can I be gentle with myself as it feels big, right? Sometimes I can recognize that my stress isn't as big as it really is, but not being upset with myself when I feel like it's overwhelming or the end of the world, right? I think you just have to be gentle. And I agree with Fran in the sense, like, it's not always about fixing your mindset, but making the steps towards a better one.
Yeah, I remember I was listening to a podcast and it was a similar question, but the guy that I forget the name of the podcast and I forget the guest, um, but he said instead of asking when is it going to when am I going to fix this is where what like instead of asking God like what like when is this going to be fixed is where it's almost like where are you taking me? And I
Hmm.
don't think I'll be honest with you, I don't think I've had any challenges compared to yours or like the challenges compared to like the things that you've gone through. So I can't relate to that directly. But if there was one example I can remember recently, and you were helping with this like application I had at Ohio State, and I worked really hard on it, and unfortunately got rejected. And I was like, this is the worst thing in the world. And I was immediately started thinking like, when is something good gonna happen out of this? And I just started really like having like a really bad like mindset. So instead of really just taking the time to think about, okay, what are some of the next steps? I felt like this was the worst thing in the world. So I think if I were to go back in time and just witness that rejection again, it's almost like, okay, I know it's unfortunate that it happened, but can we look at some of the positives and then also think about what are some things that we can control? Because, like you said, there are so many things that we can't, that are just out of our control. And
Hmm.
so, again, it goes back to what you said and Fran said, which is taking those baby steps and knowing that, you know, you're going to be I don't want to say you're going to find something better because I know that for a lot of people that's still there, but it's important not to dwell on anything and also like you said, or maybe I don't know, maybe I just forgot, but like maybe try not to think it's the worst thing in the world because there's always something better that you can potentially reach. I don't know if I made sense, but that's kind of what I think of when I think about like what are some questions you could think about or some things you can think about even when something doesn't go your way.
Yeah, no, I think that that does make sense. And like something I will say is like there is so much room for people to be upset. And I think there is this really like toxic like stereotype that being upset or being hurt when things don't work out is a bad thing. Like I don't think that's bad at all, right? Like which makes sense because if you really cared about it, like for example, a relationship and the relationship doesn't work out, like if it was a good relationship and you're like, dang, like I'm really upset that this didn't work out, like that makes sense. Like that's a very human emotion that we have, you know. You studied hard for an exam or and you didn't get the grade that you were expecting. It makes sense to be disappointed. Or honestly, let's say you didn't study for an exam and you know that, and you know you probably weren't going to do well, and then you didn't do well and you're still upset. That makes sense. Right. And there's so much room there to be upset, but still ask yourself those questions like, okay, how can I learn from this? Right. From the relationship. How can I learn from this relationship? And from the exam, like if you studied, like how can I study better? Or can I just be grace, give myself some grace that I didn't work out the same way? Or if you didn't study, like how can I study better? How can I actually study for this exam? So, I think it comes hand in hand. We're allowed to be upset and have emotions, but also it doesn't need to be consuming and it shouldn't be consuming. I think we have space in the human mind to experience those things um, in their own turn.
I want to talk about something that I feel like is very mixed. Sometimes it gets a good rap, sometimes it doesn't, which is faith. And
Hmm.
specifically like yeah, like religions and stuff. The reason why I said faith instead of religion is I know they can also be the same thing, but like you and I are practice different religions, so I know sometimes it can be a bit confusing. But I think a lot of people when it comes to religion, they have good and bad thoughts because for some people it's like it's a good thing because it's given them a sort of direction. But for some people they're like this is the worst thing on the planet. So everyone has different opinions. But I do want to ask, because I know you talked about how you weren't raised as a Christian, but you were able to find that later on in your life. And again, I know people have different viewpoints as to whether they think of it as a good or bad thing. What I am
Hmm.
curious to know from your perspective, and obviously everyone else is different, but from yours, what do you feel like if I were to like, I guess create like a Venn diagram where it's like Seika before faith, Seika after faith, and then obviously like the whatever that word is, whatever the thing they have in common, what do you feel like
Yeah.
what do you feel like were some of the differences in terms of like what Seika was like before faith what you learned after faith, and then I guess some of the things that you kind of had in common.
Yeah, I feel like honestly, perhaps my friends are a better person, people to ask. Like, I think my friends from home have seen me in both of these phases. And I would never call my faith a phase, but I think, these eras, for the lack of better terms, of before and after. Because my instinct was to say like humility. Though I know my friends would probably call me annoyingly humble. And not in a way to toot my own horn. I think there is something that can be toxic about being humble when you do it for the wrong reasons. Um, so I think before my faith, I think I was very confused. Um, and I think I had a good perspective on why I went through the things I went through. I think I used my difficulties and my hardships for a good thing, right? I was able to have a nonprofit. I passed a bill. I had really good friends. I think I was able to see my hardship, contribute to community, and have a really good outlook on life. Um, but at the same time, I think I still felt a little unfulfilled. Um, and I think for me personally, and I know this is different for every person and every religion or every sense of spirituality, like when I was introduced to God and I was able to explore this thing for myself, given my experiences, I was able to be like, oh, this is helping me find a little bit of answers. Um, and like explore my confusion in a way that feels healthy. Um, you know, and I think the main difference is I think whether or not I feel like my difficulties now or my hardships now are the end of the world. Because I would like to think my perspective has just grown over time. And obviously some things have shifted, but at the same time, I don't know. If there's something interesting I think I experienced in my life that um, I feel like I've always had a very strong sense of self. I think my faith helped me just define that, if that makes sense. Um, and then, like I was saying, I was able to find a place where I was able to address my confusion in a way where I was able to explore answers. And then down the line, I was able to accept them as true. And I think that's why it's important for people to have some sort of spirituality. Those questions like where do you go when you die, or like why do bad things happen to good people? For those existential questions where honestly you're never going to get a solid answer. I think it's important for people to look around and see what they end up finding. So I think my main perspective shift has just been, I understand that everything I go through is not going to be the end of the world. And I think that has helped me develop a little bit of grace and a firm foundation in my faith and relationship with God.
Yeah, and I know, like you said, we believe in different things, so it's gonna sound like, I guess, awkward for lack of a better term. But like,
Sure.
I would say for me growing up, I think like some of the things that we do in Islam, we pray 5 times a day, we fast for 30, pray 5 times a day, fast for 30 days. And I think growing up, it was one of those things where it's like I'll do it because it's in the like rule book. If that's
Hmm.
like because it's in the Quran, which is like obviously the religious book. So like you need to
Right.
do these things. But I think as I've gotten older, I think obviously like I said, it's different for everybody, but it's like you want to develop this like you want to figure out like I guess you want to spend more time with your religion. And so I would say I guess the difference between I wouldn't say like I wasn't like not religious, but it was like I was someone that kind of growing up I was more like I'll do it because it's it's there, like I have to do this. But I feel like what religion has done, like I'm trying to spend more time on my religion, is it almost feels like it's some sort of shield. And in the sense
Mm.
that it's similar to kind of like how people say like find your why, because when you stick to that, it kind of protects you from like what people say about you. And so with faith, it's almost like safety or like a shield from something that may be like not or maybe abnormal to people or maybe abnormal to others. So whether that's faith from like, you know, I guess I don't know, some sort of like bad practice or a topic that's like, okay, I know that just because most people do it, it doesn't mean you should do it. And
Right.
I have a friend of mine who helps me on the podcast. You obviously know Skylar, who's
Mhm.
also close to her faith. And one of the things I told her was that there's a difference between doing the popular thing and doing the right thing, and they don't always mean the same thing, because there could be in a room of 100 people, 99 people could do one thing that's not popular or that's not like morally right, but one
Right.
person is like, no, I think I'm good because this isn't right. And so faith is almost like this shield that protects you from like all these unnecessary activities, whether that's arrogancy, or just temptation to do certain things, or even with like your perspective with your with mental health, it's like you're doing this because it's going to help you as a better person. It's going to help you. You're part of a much bigger discussion, and it's not going to like be like, okay, well, because I'm this, I'm going to do all these things. It's like, again, it's like your friend said, you're annoyingly humble. But I think that's also a good thing because sometimes, because that's what faith is, like that's one of the things faith can do, which is try to make sure that you remember your purpose and that you're a human being and not try to chase anything that is unnecessary, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. And I think for me, like my faith has given me, I know we've talked about this before, but a sense of quiet confidence. Like I don't have anything to prove. And I think not feeling like I have to go into a room proving myself makes connecting with people so much easier. And not to say that I connect with people well. Like I think there's some people I meet and I'm like the connection's just not there. But I think it just gives me like a breather. Like I don't have anything to prove to anyone. Because I have this sense of security that my faith gives me. And like there was this whole analogy that my Bible study leader told me once, and it was like, oh, you just like make room for Jesus on the sidewalk or make room for God next to you on the sidewalk. And I think that really helped me put into perspective, like, how can I practice my faith every day because it's important to me? And I think that helped me develop a sense of quiet confidence. Like, I am confident, but I don't need everyone else to know that. I really don't care whether or not people think I'm confident because I know that I am. Right. And I think that really plays into like the whole security and safety thing, like you were saying. And I will say, in terms of like, you're a room of 100 people and you don't have to do the thing that everyone else is doing. Like, I think that's true even in like any religious circle. Like, you can be in a room of like 100 Christians or 100 Muslims, and because we are human still, you can still do wrong, right? Just because you're, at least in my opinion, I think, and I have this conversation all the time with like Christians. I'm like, just because you're Christian doesn't make you any better than anyone else. Like, you're just human, right? And there is this external aspect, something beyond you, something beyond of what a human, like a person, can see, right? This is this aspect of what faith is. Like, it's not about you. And I think that's very true in like the American church, where like you see a lot of people have different opinions, and you see, like Christianity being practiced so many different ways, from so many different denominations. And that can be a healthy thing in terms of like exploring questions and seeing what you have around you. But like, even if you're in a room of 100 Christians, all I will say to the other Christian is like, that doesn't mean that they're the example. Right. Like, think, look at your scripture and look at what's around you and remember who and what your example actually is before you start, relating your faith to the people around you. And I think that's something I've also recently learned, that it's not about how everyone else does it. It's about what you have learned and what you're actually following, if that makes sense as well.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add before I ask like a very really difficult question, which is, again, maybe you relate, maybe you talked about this, but it's like just because you're religious, it doesn't always mean you're like a good person. Because there are a lot of people who, like in Islam, right? We can pray 5 times a day. One of the things that hopefully every Muslim is able to do at some point in their life is to memorize the Quran.
Mhm.
I think there's like 115 chapters. And obviously that's a great thing, but it's like just because you are able to do these things, you're still a human being and you have to be able to treat other people like human beings. Even if they're different from you, even if they no matter what kind of like difficulty they're going through. Because I know like it's not just religion, it can be anyone where it's like if you see someone that has some sort of deficiency, whether that be mental health or disability, we think, oh, we're better than them. But at the end of the day, no, we're still the same. And if you're going to be bashing people for some sort of thing that they're going through, then you're not really being that ideal human being. So I think it's an important conversation to have. And I know I'm probably going to get, I hope I don't get crapped on because it's like, wait, why is a Muslim and a Christian talking about this? But I feel like different religions can still have these conversations because at the end of the day, one of the most important things that each religion teaches you is to be a good human being, which is not something it seems like it's easy to do, but when you see like I guess like the people that do focus a lot on religion, they don't always live up to that practice.
Absolutely. And I think where religions differ is, I think, is the definition of how to be a good person, right? I think whether it be like memorizing the Quran, for example, or memorizing the Bible, right? Like there's different expectations and definitions around what it means to be like, what are the practice that creates this individual into being a good person? Because I do think ultimately, I think especially with the three major Abrahamic religions, there is this sort of agreement of what quote unquote good is. But even then, like that's such a philosophical question of what is actually good. But I think ultimately there's this whole point of like striving to love others, to support others, to help others, but also to give respect to your faith and to where your ability to do good comes from, right? And again, like people from different backgrounds are more than welcome to disagree. And I think that's why it is so healthy to have these discussions, is because there is such a consensus that loving and being a good person should be the goal. How does that look? It differs. And I think it's very ignorant for me as a Christian to sit here and be like, yeah, Christians are so great, when you can look at world history and see how Christians have perhaps been so terrible. And I think what's important to say before any like Christian jumps on me for that is like, that's not to say the faith is bad, right? That's not to say that Christianity is bad. The way that it's been practiced by people who maluse it could be bad. And I think that's been true. I mean, it's even true within scriptures where you see people call themselves Christians, but they do all these bad things and they, hurt other people. At the end of the day, we're humans. And that's the whole point. I think that's why we have faith, is because we're so human. And, I think that's why it's exciting to have these conversations with you, is because, I think on both sides, there's perspectives and disagreements on how, a conversation like this can be handled. But I do think there's a level of mutual respect here that, allows us to have such an open conversation. And I think it's really encouraging, hopefully, for people to hear.
Yeah. And I was gonna say, like, even though we may disagree, and I think it's something that I know like a lot of Gen Zers struggle with, which is the idea of we can disagree and still be
Mhm.
friends. Even though we might have different viewpoints, or like this is what we do and this is what you do. At the end of the day, we still have to like, respect each other and still be friends. Um, One thing I want to talk about before we go back to the idea of mental health is this is a very I feel like this is a difficult question to ask people, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think it doesn't just apply to religion, but I think it can apply to anything that you do, which is the differences between faith, hope, and belief in your mind or in your opinion. And obviously I don't want people to be like, okay, this is what Seika said, this is the right answer. It's obviously it goes back to perspectives, and I sometimes struggle answering this question, so I do want to know from your perspective, whether it comes to religion or the work that you do or anything just in life in general, how would you explain the differences between faith, hope, and belief?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I've had conversations like this before. I mean, it's hard. I saw this, I think, on your little question sheet beforehand, and I'm like, I need to think about this. Because this is such a hard question to answer. But I think what faith is this aspect of being able to like let your hands go and be like, I trust this process, even if I don't have hope and even if I don't believe. It's like, it's like it's not the light at the end of the tunnel. It's not hoping that there, like, I feel like the light at the end of the tunnel is hope, right? You see that speck of light at the end of the tunnel and you have hope. You're like, oh my gosh, like there's light. Um, and like, I think belief is this aspect of like, I'm able to get there, right? Like the hope is there, and belief is this ability to like perhaps to be able to go get there. And then faith is kind of like, for me, when it's pitch dark, when there is what seems like or feels like there is no hope or point of believing. I think for me, faith is just like, okay, I'm going to trust the process. I'm going to let go. I'm going to fall and see where it takes me. And it's kind of, again, like that quiet confidence. It's like when I don't have that confidence, but still feel like I'm able to continue and I'm still going to continue, even if I don't really have any hope in it. And I think, I think belief kind of stands on the pillars of faith and hope. But I think you can have faith without hope. and belief. And I think you can have hope um, with faith. I'm not too sure how these pillars work in this analogy, but I think for me, belief is kind of like that third aspect is like with hope and with faith, there's this level of belief. And I think belief implies like certainty, right? Being able to be certain that XYZ is true. Like I believe that this is true. Like I think when you're a kid, for example, if you celebrate Christmas and you're told about Santa Claus, you will believe, let's say, it is true. And like you just have the certainty that that fact is true. I think with faith and hope, there's this aspect of trusting the process and trusting the unknown. And I think hope for me is kind of when you're given like a little bit of certainty, or you're given you're given a little bit of a chance to think that there's something more. And faith is when you don't see that there's something more. And when you don't understand and when you question, you still have faith that things are going to be okay. And I think what's important, I think on premise of like the Christianity side of it is like, in my opinion, I think it's important to let people question their faith. You know, you're going to be alive, let's say 80, 90 years or so. You don't question your faith at all during that time period. You know, is it even real? Because I think there is something so healthy about asking questions, especially in prayer, for example, when you don't understand things, you know, and I think if there comes a point in a person's life where you don't strongly believe, but you still have faith, I think that's a really good thing. And that's my personal perspective on it.
Yeah, that's a really great way of putting it. And it's interesting because I feel like of the three, I'd say faith is like the strongest thing because it goes back to like what you said, even whether you do know or you don't know what's happening, you have faith in knowing that something good will come out of it. But then
Mhm.
oftentimes I feel like hope and belief goes either way. Like I don't know, like I think faith is the strongest thing, and then hope and belief is like I don't know, tied for second because I don't know, maybe I feel like belief is like weaker than hope. I feel like if you have hope, that's stronger than belief. So for example, let's put it into like athletics perspective, but I'm a big US men's national team soccer fan, and their common chant is I believe that we will win even though they don't. So so it's like, can we change it up a bit, but and win a World Cup? But like the point I'm trying to make is that like sometimes using the like those two words, sometimes I feel like they can mean the same thing, but it is difficult because it's like and I totally understand where you're coming from, but even then it can still be a challenge. But I still feel like
Mhm.
at the end of the day, faith is more like there's a certainty in the sense that whether you know what's going to happen or don't know what's going to happen, you have faith in knowing that you're going to be fine or you're going to be okay. It's similar to like, and it's not even just in a religious thing, like you said, it
Yeah.
can be about anything. Like I can say, oh, I have faith in your mental health research that something, I have faith that you're going to do well in your mental health research. Even though I don't know what that journey looks like, I know that you'll come out of it
Mhm.
in like the best way possible. But if I say I have hope or belief, then it's almost like maybe or maybe not. So that's what I kind of see it as. And again, that's why I feel like I struggle with those differences. But I feel like now that I think about it, I think you can definitely separate faith, but hope and belief can definitely be a tricky slope.
Yeah, I think it is definitely a tricky zone. I mean, I think belief has such a like a firm connotation around it that like right, I believe that we're gonna win is like such a statement to make, I think, in any sense. Like, or like, you know what, I believe that you're gonna get first place. I believe that you're gonna pass this test. Like that is giving so much more of like, yeah, I know. Hope is like, yeah, I hope you pass this test. Yeah, I hope you're gonna win. It's kind of like this, like, you know, and I think that's why it's different. I think the three of these words possess different elements in a sense where belief is so firm and such a like a strong, dedicated, you know, like statement. I think hope is a little bit more flowy. And it's like, yeah, like I hope down, you know, at the end of the stream, there's something good down there. And I think recognizing the difference between these words, and the connotation between these words and the values between these words is extremely important. Because like I think again, like I guess the best analogy is like the element that each of these words really hold differs. And I think they all matter, and their level of importance changes given the circumstance or given the statement.
Yeah, for sure. I really hope that no Muslim watches this podcast and goes, okay, we need to boycott this podcast. But But I think at the end of the day, these are interesting conversations to have because I do feel like, again, when it comes to religion or faith, it's a mixed topic, and not just with Gen Zers. It could be just anyone in general. But what I would say to before we move on to like the last thing I want to talk about, which is mental health, even though we already talked about it, but there's some things I want to talk about. The one thing I will say about faith is that knowing that it does give you a sense of safety, and knowing that even though you don't see it, that it exists, and um, just understand that something good will come out of it. So yeah, that's what I'll leave it at that. But I want
Yeah.
to end the conversation by talking a bit about mental health. And one of my favorite questions to ask people, it's a awkward question, but it's a question I love asking because I think it gives out the best. It really it gets a bit of a human element into it, which is that even though there's a difference between wanting to do something and then you want to do something and you have to do something. So, for example, I don't think someone forced you to get into mental health. It was something that you wanted to do because you found interest in it. But even though you're really passionate about it, there are certain things that you don't like about the things that you do, but you have to do it. I used to say it's almost like marriage, where it's like you might love your partner, but there's some things you don't like. And then I was like, maybe that's a really weird way of putting it. So I want to know from you, because I know you've been doing this for 5, 6 years. Obviously, you're very passionate about mental health, but if you were to like kind of like give us like I guess like a what it's like to be a mental health activist in your field, because obviously you look at global research, what are some things that you don't like about what you love to do?
Hmm. I mean, that's a really great question. I think it challenged. I mean, like, I think first off, it's impossible to say that I love every single aspect of everything. Like, I love going to school. Like, I think what a great opportunity. Do I love doing assignments? No. Right. So I think that's why that is such a great question. For me, I think my perspective on mental health is a little bit different compared to the average mental health advocate, where I don't see having struggle as a bad thing. Um, and like, I'm obviously hesitant to say that because that's such a broad, general statement to make. I think there's certain struggles and experiences that this world could do without, right? And it's not to say, right, I think that that statement take with a grain of salt is all I'm saying. Um, but I don't really love like the narrative that mental being a mental health advocate is like a fix it game. I don't think it's like what we need to fix. I don't think this is about, fixing people. I think it's about caring and loving people. Um, and I think I have made an effort to be more hesitant, like online. I have a lot of friends in the mental health field that are a lot more vocal online on their social media that were like they work a lot closely with, larger like organizations or whatever. Like I know I'm saying this as someone who just got recognized by Selena Gomez, which is a pretty big flashy event. But like I think for me, that's why I chose research as my avenue to do work, is because it's beyond myself. It's beyond what I'm showing. And I think there is so much value for people who do that, but that's just not me. Um, and I guess like what I don't really love is that there's this level of respect for people that do say their stories so loudly. And I think that's good. I just wish it wasn't like I did wish it didn't come with this narrative that like if you're not telling your story, you're doing it wrong, right? Tell your story if you want to, and tell your story if that's something that you really think is valuable. I think I love that. I love hearing people's stories, and I love the people that are being vocal about their experiences. I don't think it needs to be a requirement of people in order for them to do good. And I think, that's why I cherry pick the stories in my life that I tell. Like, for example, my brother's suicide attempt, and maybe I don't get into more detail about all the circumstances that led up to it or my specific emotions around it. And I know that could be valuable in terms of destigmatizing mental health, but I don't think it's always necessary. I also don't, because like for me, I think I had that stage and that opportunity when I was in high school, where I was able to talk about what I was feeling that convinced these people to pass the bill that I was working on, right? And that's why I do that kind of the storytelling approach to research, where I'm interviewing people, asking them to tell their stories and giving them their platform if they want to, giving them a platform if they want to. but I don't think it's necessary. But that to say, like I think things like mental health will always be, at least for a very long time, a ever flowing and changing discourse. Um, and so yeah, I mean, like in my opinion, there's no single definition to what mental health is. And perhaps another thing I dislike is that people equate mental health to mental illness. And again, you don't equate going to the gym every day to cancer. Like that just doesn't make sense. And I feel like some people could get mad at that analogy. But all that to say, right? You can experience illness and that's okay. And I think that should be like more like less these like stigmatized. I think it should be, I don't know if I'm saying that right. It should be less stigmatized. But I think what's important is to recognize that everyone has mental health, and talking about mental health is not talking about mental illness. I think you can talk about mental illness and not talk about mental health. Or what's the term here? It's like you can talk about mental health but not talk about illness, but you can't talk about mental illness without talking about mental health. And I think that like that relationship is a little bit confusing for some people, but that's my perspective. And so that's what I'll say. Like there might be things that I don't like doing in this field, but I think that's because I carry the perspective that I have, not because it's invaluable. I think all the perspectives that are being poured into the mental health field at this time is extremely valuable. Just because I don't like doing it doesn't mean anything. I think it just means it's not my cup of tea, and that's not where I need to be stepping my toes in, because someone's going to do that job better than I can. And that's why I do what I do and someone else does what they do. It's not because it's invaluable. It's just because I look at it differently, and it's because that's just not where my strengths lie. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's similar to that when you said like mental health. You can talk about mental illness, but you can't always talk about. No, wait. It's like mental. You can talk about. I forget what you just said. But it's like that idea of a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle isn't always a square. Like something like that. Um, yeah, I think that's what
Mhm.
it comes to mind, which is like, yeah, it's like you talked about how like mental health. You can talk about mental health. Wait, yeah, you might need to say that again. It's like,
Yeah, you can talk about mental health without talking about mental illness. You can't talk about mental illness without talking about mental health. And honestly, come back to me in a few months and see if I still have that same perspective. Because, I think my work really goes to, I wouldn't call it preventative care, even though I think it is technically. Like I care about people, like I care about talking about mental health in a way that's before suicide, before depression. Um, but obviously still including things like stress and anxiety, rather than talking about like suicidal ideation or chronic depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, where a lot of people put their focus in. I spend more time talking about like, okay, how can you have a healthier mindset versus what are these actual illnesses? And, take illnesses with a grain of salt as well. So like, that's
yeah,
just my relationship with it.
yeah, and I was gonna say like it's sort of similar to the idea of like, yeah, now I remember the analogy. Square can always be a rectangle, but a rectangle can't always be a square. So it's like similar to that. And I think that's what you said is a really interesting answer because I went because like usually sometimes what I do is like I'll ask a question and then I'm like I think I know where they're gonna go at what they're gonna say. So like when I asked you this question, I was actually surprised you didn't say, "Oh, I don't like getting up early in the morning," because I know that usually sometimes you told me about how sometimes you would get up at like 6 or 7 in the morning,
Mhm.
and I'm like, that's a or not or even like 5 in the morning, and I'm like, that's a nightmare to get, that's a nightmare to get up early in the morning. So, um, I think that's a really interesting answer, and I think there's a lot of things that people forget about mental health, but again, um, I think that's just part of the process. Um,
Yeah, I think I'll say like, I do love like my work, and um it's easy to be like, oh, like I hate having to get up in the morning. Like I don't. Like I love the conversations I have, even if it's that early. And I love what I do. And I think those nitty-gritty details of like the process of being like working in this field um honestly goes over my head because there's so much to love. Yeah.
the last time you were here, I asked you if you weren't involved in mental health, and you said you'd be involved in climate change in one way or another. Do you see yourself going back into climate change in any way, or do you feel like you you want to stick to mental health because you've been doing it for so long?
like I think when I mentioned it, like I went to like a big picture high school for like a month, my freshman year, of high school, and I was like super interested in like sustainability. Um, and I think that's kind of like what I was implying is like, oh, I think I would have loved doing sustainability work. Um, but I think I always would have ended up in the mental health field one way or another in the sense like because I don't think if we don't have a good way to communicate to each other, we're never going to get any of these problems fixed or done, right? Solving the climate crisis. Like if we're going to raise a generation of people that continuously thinks that having anxiety is a bad thing, I really don't know if we're going to be able to address this whole climate change thing. But I think you can address them at the same time as you will. But yeah, so I don't know. I think I'm an urban studies major at college and university right now, which is the city planning. And so you kind of I see this you see like a lot of these different fields kind of working together from like engineering to like to design to healthcare. And I think that's where I see the possible connection of things going and things clicking is like, all right, how can we support mental health and how can we make communities healthier mentally and physically in a way that's sustainable? I think there's so many factors to think of. I think sustainability can always be thought of the same way I think mental health can always be thought of. So I think they're intersecting fields, and there's always going to be some type of crossover. And you see people do climate change mental health work. For example, if you go to a country that's experiencing the climate crisis in a totally different way, they're in a specific country that's experiencing high sea levels, in large flooding. How is that affecting their mental health? Because there is this correlation. And I think we see a lot of that now where these fields and passions and interests begin to intersect. And I would not be surprised, if down the line, myself or anyone else starts to get into those waters.
My last question before I let you go. Now, this is a question I've been trying to think of a signature question, and I used to have this, but then I felt like I had to change it up because it didn't really make sense. So, knowing that
Mhm.
you're technically my last guest for 2023, I'm gonna give you this question. I don't know if it works, great. If it doesn't, we can trash it. But the one of the things I ask people is if you could take out one word out of the dictionary because you don't like what this word means in the sense of like you think it has a negative effect on people, what would that word be and why? But I felt like that was a really bad question. So I'm going to pose it to you this way. It's a bit similar, which is in your personal dictionary, what word or phrase would you do you not like because you don't like what comes with that word or phrase? And I'll give you an example. So if you were to ask me, I would say complacency would not be a word in my dictionary because I don't like the idea of feeling like satisfied without the need to like improve because that's technically what complacency is, which is you're satisfied but you don't feel the need to improve. I want to be able to improve each and every week, each and every day, each and every episode and not have that feeling because I've noticed when I have had feelings of complacency, I usually have terrible interviews. At least like I'm a terrible interviewer, not like the guest is bad.
Mhm.
So in your case, like what's a word or phrase that where you're like, this word or phrase does not exist in my dictionary because this will have like a negative effect on me.
That's a really great question. I think whether it be like it's hard, and perhaps it's because I can't think of anything up in the moment, but I think my instinct is like I honestly wouldn't get rid of anything in my personal dictionary. Not because I believe in that statement, but because there's worth in knowing the other side, right? Like I rather know what complacency is so I can avoid it. And it's not because I believe in complacency, or whatever, but I think there is something to say and there's values and there's things to learn. Um, and I think there's reasons why these words and phrases are in our dictionaries to begin with. So that might be a cop out answer, but I think it's what I would give. Like there's words like, yeah, I don't know. I think there's so much complexity around it. Like I would never want to be selfish, but I would like to know what selfish is. But I also do think there is a good side of being selfish, right? Doing things for yourself, or like having that battle of conversation, with you. And I think, yeah. So I'd like to have it there to know what exists. Um, and whether or not I use that word or phrase is kind of up to me. But I do think I like having it in my back pocket or in my dictionary to know, to refer to, and to think about.
Yeah, that's a really interesting answer. And I've had some different viewpoints or different words, different phrases, but like you say, it varies from person to person, but um, yeah, I think that's a great answer. But Seika, I just want to say before, because I know I've taken a lot of your time, I just want to say thank you so much for joining the podcast again. Um, I feel like there were so many things that we talked about that I guess could be unpopular, but also important at the end of the day. And I know that as Gen Zers, having it's important to have conversations that can sometimes be uncomfortable because they are important at the end of the day. So I want to say thank you so much for joining the podcast. I know I would love to have you again for like a part three. I know we talked about last time how you have a book coming out or you're working on your book. I would love to have you on the podcast to be able to talk about your book. And I know we joked about this on the first time you were here, but like we talked about potentially having a movie. And I definitely have like new movie options. I feel like Forrest Gump will not be a great movie for you, but we can visit that later on. But nevertheless,
Forgot about that. I forgot that you referred Forrest Gump to me. That's funny. Yeah, no, I mean, obviously I enjoyed our conversations together. And I'm always happy to touch in and touch bases. Like things are consistently and always changing. And so I'm sure I'll look at these like in answers I'm giving you now and be like, honestly, I probably changed my mind, which is like, the exciting thing. And yeah, I think there is just one last thing is that people are so uncomfortable with disagreeing or having discourse about a certain subject or thing. But I really do think that should be encouraged. So thank you for having those conversations with me and for bringing me on again.
thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. If you guys like what you saw, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at the OMCG Podcast for more information on guests, preview clips, and more. Please continue to support this podcast in the future, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next episode.